Hey there folks, Zane from the Infinite Jukebox, aka the #1 Bad Brains fan, here with another album review, and today I wanted to talk about the new Ministry record, Hopium for the Masses. Ministry have seemingly lost the vast majority of the goodwill that they've developed within the industrial metal fandom throughout the 80s into the 2000s, and their output in the 2010s has been consistently received in a pretty rough manner, not to mention that the 2020s have kind of resulted in the same results. While their run from 1986's Twitch up until 2006's Rio Grande Blood is generally looked at pretty positively, with a degree of consistency that's somewhat shocking when you consider the lack of longevity that you can find in seemingly countless other legendary industrial metal bands, I kind of feel like Ministry have at least partly ruined their reputation, at least the reputation they have for putting out new music. Their last few records have been, bad, we'll say. That's not to say they've put out music so awful that people don't go back to records like The Mind is a Terrible Thing to Taste or Psalm 69. Those are still classics, they always will be, but albums like 2013's From Beer to Eternity and 2021's Moral Hygiene have definitely caused people to rightfully expect the bare minimum from Ministry every time they put out a new record, and perhaps the worst of it came in 2018 with their album Americant, or America Can't if you want to properly read the title like how it's spelled. And that album, depending on who you ask, might actually be one of the worst metal albums of the 2010s. And by depending on who you ask, I mean me. I think that's one of the worst metal albums of the 2010s. That album in particular, with its heavy-handed but thin politics and political conceptualizations, highlighted the worst, most cringe-inducing, and undeniably outdated qualities of Ministry, both from a musical standpoint and from a lyrical standpoint, really just showing off how far the band have fallen off, especially in a relatively quick manner, considering they were one of the few notable bands within the realm of extremely heavy metal throughout the 80s and 90s that were initially pretty solid into the 21st century, actually probably one of only a few handfuls. And now here we are with Hopium for the Masses, Ministry's first full-length studio album in 3 years, and it reaches the same degree of quality that most of their recent material has reached, which is, we'll say below the bar of expectation, despite that bar being extremely low. Like, you know when you've been playing Limbo like for a long time when you're like a little kid and the bar gets so low that everyone just starts to like kind of stand and just like hop over it or like walk over it because it's not physically possible to get lower than that. That's the bar of expectation that I think many other people have for Ministry, and this album still managed to go under that bar. You get my point. Above all else, Hopium for the Masses just feels like a half-hearted record, if I'm being completely honest, and that lack of determination and that total sense of carelessness to put out anything of really definable substance seemingly seeps into everything from the instrumentals to the lyrical content here, and that's a shame because if there's ever any record that Ministry has put out that really needed a ton of passion put into it, it's this one. The reason for that is that, not unlike a pretty massive chunk of Ministry's 21st century output up to this point, Hopium for the Masses is a deeply political record that desperately wants to have something to say in the current political landscape, and there is certainly a lot for the band to talk about. I mean, they've had a ton to talk about in the past, and this isn't even their first time getting political. Most of their stronger 2000s material was about the Bush administration in the United States of America. But here, it's just different, but let me elaborate a little bit more. In a world where discussions about things like the rising violence of the alt-right or humanity's lack of care for the environment become topics of talking that seemingly grow more important with each passing day, it feels like there's so much for Ministry to get into here. They could have made some sort of triumphant return, at least conceptually, not necessarily musically, but my point is there is so much for Ministry to do here, and it almost feels ambitious that they would even want to put out a political album in the kind of social climate that we're in right now. There is so much to tackle, and I think that it's admirable if you are genuinely trying to do a record like that, but that's where the issue comes in. Hopium for the Masses feels like Al Jorgensen and company reading the Cliff's Notes version of controversial topics without actually putting too much thought into it. I mean, the group could have taken so many ideas here and molded them into something so much more immediate, because a lot of the topics that they bring up here and these stances they take are inherently admirable and respectable and good moraled in nature. It's just that, again, it feels like they read the TLDR of some really long blog post about some sort of polarizing topic or some sort of extremely important social or political topic and came up with a stance that is equally as thin and lacking in genuine qualities. So, for example, you have the track Just Stop Oil, and you know what? That has a super solid concept behind it. Environmentalism and discussions about humans as a species, as treatment of the earth, and the lack of preservation for what is left of it, more important now than ever. Look, I'm not going to pretend like I'm a biologist or anything like that, but even myself, who probably wouldn't even pass a 6th grade spelling bee, can tell you that the world is in turmoil from an environmental standpoint, to say the least. And it's not even the first time Ministry have touched on things like this. The album Moral Hygiene from back in 2021 was almost exclusively about environmentalism in many regards. But that's where the issue comes in. This feels more like a cheesy, corny episode of Captain Planet than it does a song by a band that are trying to make any sort of point. And that honestly might be an insult to Captain Planet. I mean, he was at least trying. Then again, despite it trying to be a sort of call to arms, I think that Just Stop Oil's title is pretty accurate, because instead of Ministry really trying to educate the listener about something or trying to talk about something relating to environmentalism that they're really passionate about, all they're doing is just saying, hey, destroying the environment? Bad. Stop it. And it's like, of course, I know that. You don't need to hold my hand and walk me through the absolute basics of why the world is in a terrible state right now. I am well aware. You don't need to do the most simplistic baby talk version of this and just use an instrumental from the mediocre side of industrial metal to back it up. I really do think that Ministry have good points to make in terms of environmentalism on that track. It's just that they refuse to elaborate on it, and because of that, there's this, again, lack of genuineness behind it. It just kind of feels like they're doing the bare minimum to appeal to people who want a little bit more environmentalism in their music. And to those kinds of people, I say there are so many bands trying to make a legitimate difference in that regard. Why would you choose Ministry? Elsewhere, you have the track Cult of Suffering, which is so poorly written that it's almost mind-numbingly repetitious in nature, and it being about the invasion of Ukraine is honestly something that I think feels a bit more exploitative than it does actually serious in terms of the manner in which it is performed. I mean, it almost feels like Ministry just kind of scrolling through a textbook of major world events that have been absolute tragedies in recent years and just landing on the invasion of Ukraine and being like, let's write a song about that, and, you know, let's just do like 3 verses and repeat that for 6 minutes. And that's extremely frustrating, to say the least. There's also the album opening track BDE, which, for those not in the know, is an acronym for the phrase Big Dick Energy, which is a phrase I never want Al Jorgensen to say ever again, please God. And it's a track about toxic masculinity, and in particular how toxic masculinity can often be a major part of the social and political climate that is supported by the right wing, by the alt-right. And again, great topic. I think that it's a fantastic thing to write about, especially from a band of dudes who are involved in the metal scene. And I'm not sure if you're aware, but there are a lot of douchebag men involved in the realm of heavy music. And I don't think that's necessarily a secret. I mean, that's true for the music industry and, well, the world at large, but especially within heavier music. There are a lot of male abusers within metal, and some of those people have definitely had their faces shown within metal, within punk. So I think that kind of thing is great for Ministry to talk about as such a legendary band. It's just that they don't do anything with it, and I would almost argue that the message that they're trying to bring about there is undermined by the fact that they're using this buzz term acronym of BDE. I just think as a whole, it's almost like Ministry aren't taking what they're saying seriously, and because of that, I can't take what they're saying seriously. Not because I don't appreciate or respect what they're saying, but because I feel like they're just being completely disingenuous when they do say it. Look, Hopium for the Masses, from a philosophical standpoint, from a political standpoint, is, in my eyes, constantly on the right side of history. And what thin politics are here are agreeable, but really, because of how simplistic they are, I kind of find it hard to really take anything away from this. I mean, this feels like the kind of person that says, oh, I've done research and just read, like, one CNN article and then just called it a day, and that's just as bad as the other side of the argument. People who don't do research on topics that they're standing for and then just parrot the most vague, uninformed opinions possible are absolutely the worst kind of most damaging people within society and within politics. And just because of the fact that what Ministry are saying here is, again, absolutely agreeable, doesn't mean that I think they're being honest about it. I mean, sure, they may totally hold these opinions, but I just don't think that they're being honest in feeling like they warrant an album that's entirely political at this point in time. I mean, you could make the same criticisms towards American or even their 2000s Bush administration albums, but as a whole, I just feel this album, Hopium for the Masses in particular, feels especially unwarranted, and it's just by luck and by political affiliation for their aesthetic historically that they managed to be completely agreeable and, again, kind of on the right side of the argument here. And that's because all of the aforementioned songs, they have good concepts, and they stand for positions that are rooted in good morals. It's good for people to call out abuse of power within toxic masculinity. It's good for people to call out the lack of environmentalism that a lot of people just don't take up within their lives. It's good for major bands like this to call out major political events that see specific groups of people being genocided or attacked in some way, their livelihoods being destroyed. Those are all good things. It's just the issue comes in when Ministry almost impressively feel wildly disingenuous about absolutely everything they say here. And again, that's not me trying to say that they don't actually believe in everything that they're saying here. It's just that it feels like they refuse to put in the effort to actually develop their opinions beyond the most thin, basic, and at times uninformed, yet somehow still, generally speaking, correct and good-minded opinions. All I'm saying is that despite this being a political record, there's barely any politics to be found here. And you know what? If you are looking for something that's easily digestible, if you want an album that makes you feel intelligent because you're listening to a political album, and I don't know, American Idiot by Green Day is a little too tough for you, then maybe Hopium for the Masses will be your record. But other than that, I just truly do not see how this would appeal to anybody on any side of any given argument here. I mean, even if you're this horrible person who's a fascist alt-righter or anything like that, I still think that you would see this and you would laugh at it. And if you are on a much more agreeable side of the conversation and think that people who are within the alt-right are fucking psychopaths, then I would also think that you would see this and laugh at it, because at the end of the day, Ministry isn't saying anything here. They're not doing anything here. They're just spewing out the most mind-numbing, pointless garbage possible and trying to pass it off as something related to activism, which it is not. And look, that's not me trying to posture or anything like that. I'm not going to pretend like I'm out here doing amazing activist work or anything like that. But I do think there are plenty of bands and musical artists and just artists within various forms of mediums within art that are doing amazing things, doing amazing work as activists for whatever given topic. And Ministry are almost taking attention away from those people by being this decaying industrial metal band that's just desperate to cling to relevancy in any possible way they can at this point. It certainly doesn't help that Hopium for the Masses isn't even decent instrumentally, though I think to an extent that's probably to be expected considering their track record over the course of the past, say 15 years, give or take. Much of the album's runtime is made up of the same tired, over-milked industrial metal instrumentals that you've been hearing from Ministry for decades at this point, just with significantly less amounts of passion than you probably would have heard 20, 25 years ago. I mean, the riffs chug decently enough, I guess, but they rarely feel memorable, and they often start to bleed together after a while. I mean, after quite a few listens of this record, I can only tell songs apart from this song that's slightly faster than the other song, or that one song that's kind of slower than the rest of the songs, and that is not a good thing. Frontman and core Ministry member Al Jorgensen's voice sounds extremely strained as well, like he's forcing out every single note possible. And while I completely understand that as one gets up there in age, vocals can, get weaker and so on, I just maybe would not continue to do the same vocal style at that point when it's genuinely weaker than it once was, or at least apply those vocals to a different context where maybe things will work out a bit better. I mean, shit, I think maybe Al Jorgensen would actually be decent in a sort of post-industrial, more ambient context, because it would be less demanding of him in, that regard, or at least demanding in a way that is different from what he's doing here on Hopium for the Masses and from what he's been doing with Ministry for decades. I digress. Al Jorgensen just sounds awful here. Appearances from Jello Biafra, mostly of Dead Kennedys fame, as well as Corrosion of Conformity's Pepper Keenan on Aryan Embarrassment and Goddamned White Trash, respectively, don't really seem to be features that have much point to them or purpose. More so Ministry just sort of nudging the listener of, like, this is the political album, so we got two artists that are associated with similar stuff, despite the fact that COC and the Dead Kennedys, despite being now shells of what they once were in their prime, had much more developed viewpoints and much more legitimate, believable stances than what Ministry have been presenting over the course of the past 10 years. Whereas Jello Biafra at least has enough charisma to bring to the table to cover up some otherwise somewhat unpassably vague leftist lyricism, Pepper Keenan's voice has seen better days, and honestly, neither really fit on a Ministry record, or at least not a Ministry record in 2024. I mean, Gibby Haynes appearing on Psalm 69, arguably their biggest song with Jesus Built My Hot Rod back in the 90s, was fine, so I don't see why Jello and Pepper being here would really be that much weirder, but it doesn't sound right, and it also sounds strange to say that the lead singer of the Butthole Surfers sounded better with Ministry than two significantly more controlled vocalists and performers on this record do, but if anything, that might just be testament to the lack of quality that everyone I just mentioned has been putting out over the course of the past couple of years, except Jello. Jello, what are you doing here, man? You're better than this. That isn't to mention the various samples of stuff like news reports and political demonstrations and speeches and various other adjacent media that Ministry puts into the record here, which just feels like a corny attempt to sort of highlight some sort of non-existent underlying philosophical quality to this record, almost like Ministry saying, see, this is what we're talking about, but when the actual lyrics of the record amount to nothing, that is also voided because there's nothing to point out in regards to some point that they're trying to make. It just kind of feels like this a very half-hearted attempt to be adding some degree of weight to this album when there's nothing to add to in the first place. Hopium for the Masses could have initially been seen as a misguided album that nonetheless had good intentions based on the lyrical content, and I could definitely see how upon first glance one would take up that stance. I mean, like I said, there are a lot of songs here that are wildly underbaked, just completely raw in the worst way, that nonetheless have good stances, have, at least good morals and, a trajectory aiming towards positivity, and are generally agreeable, but the lack of instrumental passion being found here, just the absolutely phoned-in performances that sound like the most mediocre version of what Ministry has sounded like for decades at this point, I think I would argue just kind of goes to prove the complete lack of passion, the lack of want, the lack of everything that's found here. Hopium for the Masses may be just about on par with most records that Ministry has put out in the last few years, but for any band that was on a better trajectory or had a higher degree of respect within the metal community at large for their recent material, this would be a devastating blow, like a true career killer here if, I don't know, like, say, Strapping Young Lag got back together tomorrow and dropped this, just their legacy would be destroyed, just devastating moment for them, surely. Like, this is what the by Black Flag levels of really just tainting a band's legacy and discography. And look, I'll say this, it is undeniably a good thing that a band as famous, a band as well-regarded, a band as legendary as Ministry is taking a stance against alt-right people, various other bigots, who often, unfortunately, infect the metal scene. I mean, I hate the fact that every time I discover a new black metal band, I have to look up if they're Nazis or not. That's disgusting, and I hate the fact that I have to do that with every fucking black metal band I find, let alone bands from various other subgenres in metal. It's an incredibly frustrating thing, and it's good to hear a band like Ministry taking a stance against people like that, and I honestly wish that more old school metal bands would do that and had the balls to do so. I just think it's very, very unfortunate that Ministry don't even try to make it sound like they care here. The band present all of the ideas they have on this record in the laziest possible way, and I don't think it would be appropriate for me to say that they truly, in their personal lives, do or do not believe in the messages being provided here. I'm not saying that they're fake activists or anything like that, but I do think this album is one of fake activism. I think this is a pseudo-political album. I think it's one of their most contrived releases to date, and as a whole, I think it's just an aging industrial metal band grasping at relevancy by constantly bringing up topics that would be vaguely leftist and somewhat polarizing within their fan base so that there's more discussion surrounding them. And if you want to call that a conspiracy theory, then fine, I guess, but that's just the way I see it. Look, all I'm saying is, if you want heavy music of any given genre or subgenre in your life that's actually trying to make some sort of difference, go listen to Imperial Triumphant, go listen to Soul Glow, go listen to Petrol Girls, go listen to Backwash, go listen to Gloss, go listen to any band that's actually trying in some form to provide perspective, to provide some degree of empowerment within various communities, because God knows this is just Ministry rambling off whatever they get from some sort of Wikipedia page. If you told me they plunked this into some AI that summarized an article for you and then just spaced that out into lyrics, I might actually be inclined to believe it. I'm going to give this record 1 star out of 5. And with that being said, that is the end of this album review. I've been Zane from the Infinite Jukebox. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.